Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us online for this timely, critical, sad, but important and political debate on post-war Ukraine, embedding liberal democracy. We have a star cast of panelists and contributors for you. Everyone from, you're looking at people who are both those steeped in looking at ideology and what that means for us in terms of modes of democracy. We have a Nobel Peace Prize winning contributor who's worked tirelessly to document what the implications have been and actually to show us what's been happening in terms of the absence of rule of law and the heinous crimes of war that are impeding on citizens of Ukraine. We have an institution building, which is our Ombudsman service. So like in many societies, they can be a critical pathway for embedding trust or improving faith that actually processes can be followed, but also a necessary check and balance in any good society. And then we also have a colleague who is representing a number of equality issues, but also fundamentally any society that's good and is able to represent the widest interests, or a good democracy, has to be one that actually places equalities at its heart. So this conversation obviously is at a time when we are all marking, and the world has been marking, an annual disgrace that we're having to think about. It's 1 year since the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And whilst it's been the uppermost of all of our visual minds, hearts and souls, one of the things that we've been really careful to note as we've come to this 1 year is to not normalize this war. Our approach as a think tank has been, let us not forget that some of the things that we're witnessing now, we witnessed less than 100 years ago, and let us learn from that period of time in our lives, and therefore do not normalize this war. If we do, it will be another crisis that is either frozen or castigated to the margins of our political, economic and sociological importance and framework of thinking. So today we're here. This is one of our last debates as a part of our campaign on Do Not Normalize the War, to actually reflect on that aspiration, that sense of imagination of what would post-war Ukraine look like, and how do we actually bake into a society coming out of war the principles, the institutions and the ways of working of fairness, democracy, good governance, and at the end of it, treating people in each other with fairness, justice and equality. So that's what we have on the menu for you. I'm very pleased firstly to welcome David. David, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. You have recently written on the topic of illiberalism versus autocracy, democracy, and what we have to be thinking about in any sphere about what the balance is when we're thinking about building liberal democracy, and how do we think about the issue of force, violence, as a part of creating a better deal. Fairly controversial, but over to you to share with us your thinking that actually what Ukraine represents for the world at the moment, because it has been both within Ukraine, the region, but actually it has been unsettling a global system and has made us wake up. But over to you for your thinking on what do we need to be mindful of and what do we need to be thinking about as we move forward. David, over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. And first off, let me say thank you,
David. You should now, if you just say something now.
Yeah, am I still on mute?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, let me say first off that thank you for having me. This is a really important topic, and I agree wholeheartedly with the idea that we should do everything we can to prevent normalizing the war. And also let me say that my research has been funded by the United States Department of State, by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and I speak for myself. So I do not represent anyone aside.
My apologies, colleagues. I think we've got a little bit of an internet issue really here, so we can't hear David as clearly. Okay, let's go back. Hopefully internet, the waves won't interrupt us anymore. It might be your internet, actually. I've been told that actually ours is pretty full force. So let's have another go. Over to you again.
All right. First off, thank you for having me. As I was saying, my research has been supported by both the United States Department of State and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and I speak for no one other than myself. And so the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today are mine alone. And I just need to make that clear. And I think there are some important things to think about when we think about the future of Ukraine. And the first thing is that the post-war is going to be fundamentally different than where we are now, precisely because the war will be over. And right now, the war is, sort of enforcing a kind of unity on the discussions we see around Ukraine, because everyone is concerned about making sure that Ukraine prevails in this conflict. Once the war is over, Ukraine's being able to prevail in the conflict will be taken off the table, and that then creates the political space for other kinds of conflicts to emerge, and in particular about what kind of Ukraine we're going to see in the post-war period. And so we can't just extrapolate from what we see today to, thinking that that's going to be the lay of the land that we see in the future. And so that's the first point. The second point is that there's just been enormous suffering in this war, and the intense traumas that the people of Ukraine have experienced is going to put into motion a real search for meaning. Because people, and this is a natural human need, want to make sense out of what they see and then connect it to a moral world, moral values, and say, what does this suffering mean for me? What does it mean about the people that I'm connected to, the people that I love? And this search for meaning is, going to be, for better or worse, manipulated by political entrepreneurs, because, there are going to be people who, will say, well, okay, they're going to create narratives about what the war has been about in ways that advance, their political vision in the post-war world. And so what we're likely to see after the war has ended is the emergence of multiple nationalist narratives about the war in Ukraine, what it means and what it implies for what a just Ukraine in the future should look like. Some of those narratives will be very consistent with the idea of liberal democracy that we see practiced in, the broader liberal system that's part of the European project, that is, sort of the underlying principles and values of the European Union. But not all of them will. Partly, a struggle between the forces of autocracy and democracy, and a struggle for the future of liberal democracy is that there's a real imbalance in sacrifice in the Ukraine war in a way that actually weakens the moral claims that the United States, Ukraine's liberal allies are making about the war. And that is just simply that, it is Ukraine that is fighting the war for liberal values, but it is not us. One of the most striking things about being an American and coming to Europe is to visit the Allied cemeteries from World Wars I and World Wars II, and the ways in which that shared sacrifice, creates a bond that ties us to one another at a very deep and moral level. And, when we have wartime, and if the war continues like it has gone so far, there will not be Allied cemeteries in Ukraine. There will be Ukrainian cemeteries in Ukraine. And what that does is it weakens the ability of us here to say, well, as we think about the future of Ukraine, these are the kinds of values that we want enshrined in the political system that Ukraine generates in the post-war world, because we just simply haven't fought for them. We haven't sacrificed for them. And so there will be people in Ukraine who will say, what right do you have to tell us how to define our democracy, to tell us what kinds of principles we should put in our democracy, given that it is Ukrainians fighting and dying for Ukrainians and no one else. And so we've acted as a paymaster and not a combatant. Weaken our material strength or our economic strength, but what it does weaken is our moral strength. That are important to us and that are important to Ukraine, and that we should jointly build. Because there will be people in Ukraine who don't agree with those values, and we'll see that the West will have acted as a paymaster, not a combatant, and therefore we lack inherent legitimacy to make sort of strong authoritative claims about what Ukrainian democracy should look like. And I think that weakness is something that needs to be in the forefront of our minds, here on this side, as we think about how to sort of manage the post-war world. And
Yeah, we keep on losing you, David. It's a pity because you are
form
coming
the
up with
question
such
and
good
answer. And I
commentary.
think one is that means that, all right.
Yeah, I don't know what to do about that. I think my colleagues are telling me it's the internet your end that seems to be not that very stable. But it's such a pity because you're making us think very long and hard. You're coming up with philosophical dilemmas. No, it's true because I mean, when you say that we have no right, and actually it's about Ukrainian self-determination, people might be scratching their heads and thinking, actually, the whole system in the globe has been crashed in one way or another. We have energy insecurity on a level we've never had before. We've got countries across Europe and the world who are busting their foreign aid and defense budgets to support the common effort to create a better fight and to hopefully rid Ukraine of Russia. You can see the fallout in terms of acceptance of refugees and asylum seekers across Europe, millions, especially women and children. And yet it will be difficult to understand from people to say, actually, we have no part in rebuilding that. Actually, it has to be self-determined by Ukrainians, although we are the paymasters, and therefore, perhaps we need to take a back seat. I know you're not saying that, but that's how it could come across. But let's hope that it's generated some deep thinking, because actually the point of this debate is to have deep reflection, is to have differing points of view, because actually it has been a biggest wake-up call, other than what we've had with the pandemic and COVID-19. Since then, when you think about it, the biggest global alarm bell has been the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And it's made us think about systems, global supply chains, the post-war settlements that were meant to actually prevent this kind of nonsense from happening, yet it hasn't. And so therefore, what does it say about agreements that were reached after World War II? The number of institutions across the world and in Europe that have been built to vouchsafe and maintain peace, yet when it comes to it, it doesn't really work. People are scratching their heads saying, actually, did we get it right? Or are they out of date? And do we need to revolutionize our approach to the modern circumstances we find ourselves at this part of the early part of the 21st century, to think about what kind of settlements do we need to be thinking about, institutional infrastructures, rather than simply thinking that the old ways of working are going to work. So thank you for provoking all of those thoughts. I'm going to, so hopefully I hope that I will bring you back, David, because I'm hoping that people will have lots of questions, and hopefully your internet might be a bit more secure. Colleagues, I just want to remind you, please put your names on your screens if you can, if you've got the facility, and keep your screens on. It'll help me, because this is online, so all I'm going by is you're looking at you on these multiple screens, so I can see who I can bring in. So, and also if you want to ask a question or raise an issue, please don't hesitate to use your virtual hand, and you know what that is. It's where the icon is, and then just press that and just put it up. Also, secondly, try and use the web chat. And what we try and do, the Zoom chat, what we do is we document that. It's an opportunity for you to share your thoughts and put in documents or resources you think that will be useful for this debate. So don't hesitate to do that if I can't get all of you in. So I'm now going to move on. If none of you have a question or an issue in response to what David said, please do think about it though. Put your hand up, or put something on the chat if you have a thought that's been inspired by what David has said. I'm going to move to someone who many of us know does not need much of an introduction, as Oleksandra. Oleksandra, you have been instrumental in bringing and shining a light and a torch on abuses. You've been someone that has actually been our moral compass globally, but also within, to really understand the kinds of crimes that are being perpetuated, and for that you have been given the Nobel Peace Prize, in terms of actually the prize laureate for documenting these things. And the question to you is, I was going to say, how important is it to ensure that war crimes are dealt with? But actually that feels like a stupid question. I think the question for me is that how do we ensure that rule of law is something that we don't lose sight of, both now and into the future, in terms of building better democracy, both in Ukraine but also globally? That the issue of rule of law, and how do we make sure it is something that we can rely on, and that the punishment fits the crime? Over to you, Oleksandra. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. I have 3 points to raise. And my first point is that this war has a very distinct value dimension. This is not just a war between 2 states. This is a war between 2 systems, authoritarianism and democracy. I will remind you that this war started not in February 2022, but in February 2014, when Ukraine obtained a chance for quick democratic transformations after the collapse of the authoritarian regime due to revolution of dignity. And in order to stop us on this way, Putin started this war of aggression, occupied Crimea and part of Lugansk and Donetsk regions, and then later, after 8 years, he extended this war to large-scale invasion. Because Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom. And in this war, Putin tried to convince the whole Ukrainian that we made a wrong choice 9 years ago when we fight for democracy, rule of law, and human rights. He also wants to convince the whole world that democracy, rule of law, and human rights are fake values because they couldn't protect you during this war. So in order to respond to this value dimension of the war, we have to demonstrate justice. And my several 2 points is justice as a precondition to peace, and third, justice as a precondition to transition. First, when we speak about justice as a precondition to peace, I want to emphasize that we faced with unprecedented amount of war crimes after the large-scale invasion. Our organization united our efforts with several dozens of human rights organizations into a tribunal for Putin initiative, and working jointly only for this first year of large-scale invasion, we documented more than 33,000 episodes of war crimes. And this is an enormous amount, but it is still a tip of iceberg, because Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. And Russia attempts to break people's resistance and occupy Ukraine by the tool which I call the immense pain on civilian population. And this is so because before, Russians was never punished for all war crimes that they committed in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Syria, in Libya, in other countries of the world. This violence and denial of human dignity become a part of Russian culture, and Russians start to believe they can do whatever they wanted. That is why we must break the circle of impunity. We must create a special tribunal and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and other Russian war criminals accountable, not only for Ukrainians, but for other nations, which can be possible next target of Russian aggression. There will be never sustainable peace in our region without justice, where Russia for years used a war as the tool how to achieve geopolitical goals and uses war crimes as the tool how to win this war. And third, the last point is justice as a precondition for democratic transformations. Last year, the sociological survey was conducted in Ukraine, and people was asked, what will be the main disappointment for them after the war will end? And majority of people, 65%, answered the impunity for Russian war crimes. So we have to face with the demand of millions of people for justice, and we can't ignore this demand because it can quickly turn to something else if we not be effective to respond to this demand. And when we speak about democratic transformation in post-war Ukraine, it's very important to emphasize that it's not enough just to adopt the qualities law and build new formal institutions, because values of society always prevail. That is why we must demonstrate justice, because we need energy of people who believe that rule of law is essential, that democracy is working, that justice is possible, even though delayed in time. Without this energy, it will be very difficult for us to go on under the way which was underlined by a revolution of dignity 9 years ago. Thank you.
Oleksandra, thank you so much. Very deeply thought through, and you pose both philosophical and political challenges, not only from within, but also without, as in outside of Ukraine and the partners that are all working in different ways to support the regaining of democracy, if you like. Oleksandra, if you bear with me for one more moment or so, I just want to ask you, given what you've witnessed so far, we've seen the effort, it's a year on, we know that people might feel beleaguered, tired, and even the politicians will be feeling the burden of keeping up that tempo, having that sense of resilience, and continue to have that ambition and hope and fire in their belly. In your sense, in terms of where we find ourselves now, how hopeful do you feel at the moment for some of the things that you've set out? So how hopeful do you feel right now where we find ourselves, given how we've seen the world theatre, if you like, respond to it? But then, you know, also could you reflect and share with us whether you think some of the things that we've been doing from the outside could have been done better?
Thank you very much for these questions. Just to briefly respond, I'm looking future with optimism, but I don't see this future will be easy. Why I'm looking with optimism? Because each Ukrainians know in this war for what we are fighting for. You can take any sociological polls for recent years, for last year, for other years, like you will see that freedom is the first value and for Ukrainians. And in this war, we are fighting for a freedom in all senses, for a freedom to be independent country, but not Russian colony, for a freedom to be Ukrainians and to preserve our identity, to develop our language and culture, and for a freedom to have our democratic choice, just a chance to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected, governments is accountable, judiciary can provide justice, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And we are paying a very high price just for this chance. Also, it's very important to mention that this war has a genocidal character. That is why we can't stop fighting for freedom and for democracy. If we stop fighting, there will be no more us. And second question, can you remind it, please?
I wanted to understand what could we be doing better for having, you know, because you know that it's like COVID, and I'm not making the same comparison. Something hits a system that shocks a system globally, locally and nationally and internationally, and we understand now that actually a lot of our national systems weren't up to it. And we were, whilst millions are spent on, you know, disaster recovery or, you know, scenario planning, when it actually happens, we were weak. The war we never thought would happen, right? And now we've seen this coming together globally. NATO is strengthened, and there's a real sense of, you know, Finland and others wanting to become part of this global club of securing and maintaining peace. But we knew the systems that we've now are in weren't really fit for it. Given what you've watched and seen, what could we be doing better? So if you were, so imagine we've got some NATO people here. You've got the ear of Stoltenberg and, you know, of Biden's, you know, administration, say, you know, please, guys, this is what you should be thinking more of.
Thank you. A lot of things first appeared on symbolical level, on level when ideas and senses are emerging and then become our reality. That's why I will remind you that when the large-scale invasion started, after some period, the democratic world took the narrative. Let's help Ukraine not to fail in this war with Russia. And we started to get first support, like weaponry, economical sanctions, humanitarian assistance, etc., etc. And we are very grateful for this support. But now we need to switch to a next narrative. Let's help Ukraine to win fast. And this is a huge difference between these two narratives. Let's help Ukraine not to fail, and let's help Ukraine to win fast. And in order to win fast, I must admit, and this is maybe very weird to hear from the human rights defender, that we need a modern weaponry. Because, like, for current moment, I can't rely upon on legal instrument to help people who live in occupied territories. And every day we recorded a horrible crimes which is committed against people there, and these people have no possibilities to defend their freedom, their rights, their property, their life, and their beloved ones from terror, from murder, from torture. Like, I can remind you that when Kharkiv region was liberated, we found the same torture chambers in each villages and the same mass graves in near Izum, which we saw before that in Kiev region, after liberation of Kiev region. And in one mass grave under the number 319, it was buried the children writer Volodymyr Vakulenko. He was disappeared during Russian occupation, and but his family to the last moment believed that he is alive, but as thousands of other Ukrainian civilians are in Russian captivity. But then after identification, it was clearly understand that he was killed by Russians. So they killed Russian children without any military, they killed children writer without any military purpose. Russians killed children writer only because they could. That's why we need to liberate this territory, because we're not fighting just for territory. First and foremost, we are fighting for people who live there.
Oleksandra, thank you so much. Again, as ever, you arrest our attention and provoke our thoughts. I also want to say to everyone, actually, colleagues, you may not be aware, but Oleksandra is one of our first Ukrainian European Young Leaders. In the context of the war, we have a program called European Young Leaders, and we made sure that on this occasion we extended the nominations for a European Young Leader, and we're really pleased to have you as a part of our class of 2023, and we'll be seeing you very soon next week, I hope, as a part of our first meeting of our class of 2023. But thank you. You can see, why you were given that prize, but also the importance of the kind of, I suppose, moral compass and authority you hold up. Because I think you're right. I think most people will agree. There's something about, if we do not let us normalize this war, the only way we can do that is to act fast and with modernity in our approach, both in terms of the weapons, but also our mindsets about how we deal with this. Because living in the past about how we do it, it's not going to work for us. So thank you very much. I'm just going to, colleagues, I don't see any hands up. So I'm going to pick on some people before I come to our other two speakers, because I think I'd really like to get your sense of what you're listening to. What's your reaction to it? So, but also, there's a rich cast list on this kind of virtual debate. So I'm going to firstly go to, actually I want to go to Olga. Olga, you're also a European Young Leader in our class of 2023. You're the Czech Deputy Speaker of the Parliament. I hope you can hear and see me. Olga?
Hello, actually this is not Olga speaking. I'm sorry, but there's a huge debate in our parliament at this point, so I had to just be here for her for just a short period of time and take notes for her. So
Good.
if you could pick somebody else, that would be really nice, and then she'll be here in like 5-10 minutes, I believe, so maybe she could give you her opinion.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do, don't worry, not a problem at all. I'll give her our best regards, and I hope the debate's going well. I'm going to go to, I hope I pronounce this name properly, Lyubov, the First Secretary in Defense, Ministry of Defense, for Foreign Affairs in Ukraine. Are you there? You're Political Director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ukraine. Lyubov, are you there? Ah, I can see you. I think you need to unmute yourself, Lyubov. There you go.
Yes.
Hello.
Thank you, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm very pleased to participate in this event. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and participants for paying attention to Ukraine and for being sure in our victory. As if we are discussing the post-war Ukraine, it means that we are sure in its future. I agree that it is very important not to normalize the war and to think about possible risks to be able to address them. About two topics of today, which were mentioned in agenda: how will we ensure democratic developments in the post-war period and deal with possible threats of rising nationalism and corruption? I would remind that since 2014, when Russia launched aggression against Ukraine, it very actively spread the narrative about Ukrainian nationalism. In reality, promoting the idea that being Ukrainian in Ukraine, being patriotic, it means nationalism. In 2022, based on these false narratives, Russia accused Ukraine already not in nationalism, but even in Nazis, and used it for explaining its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's really worth to mention that committing genocide of Ukrainian people, acting as a terrorist state, trying to destroy civil infrastructure of Ukraine, Russia still continues accusing Ukraine in nationalism and Nazism, because we resist, because we want to live, and because we fight for our existence. We fight for independence and freedom, for freedom living in democratic state, and for freedom to choose our future. We count that we will become very soon the EU and NATO member. In this way, it is important to create society based on inclusive approach. I would remind that yet during the implementation of the Visa Liberalization Action Plan, Ukraine adopted the legislation which ensures non-discrimination at any base, including on the basis of sexual orientation. Before the war, Ukraine adopted the law on the indigenous people of Ukraine. In summer 2022, already during the war, we ratified the Istanbul Convention. Implementation of 7 recommendations of the European Commission to start accession negotiation with the EU means adoption of the law on national minorities. This document based on the principles and practices used in the EU countries and countries members of the European Council. So we count that it will be just approach applied to Ukraine in evaluating this law. Tackling corruption and strengthening the rule of law is also a part of reaching the EU standards. But what is even more important for the success, it is expectation of the society, expectation of our people. Ukraine and corruption, those two words are not synonymous, not even more. And now, even more than ever. Ukraine has taken very serious measures to combat corruption since 2014. Such anti-corruption institution established in Ukraine as National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, the High Anti-Corruption Court have demonstrated their resolve to investigate and prosecute corruption cases. Electronic asset declaration system for public officials, transparent public procurement system ProZorro, digital government embodied by the mobile application and web portal D. These are only some of examples of Ukraine's successful efforts to tackle the problem of corruption, which other states would only seek to reproduce. As an EU candidate country, we will, of course, not stop introducing additional measures to strengthen the rule of law. And Ukrainian society would simply not accept any manifestation of corruption undermining our capacities to withstand Russia's full-scale invasion and attempts to destroy Ukrainian statehood as it is. Even today's discussion shows how active is Ukrainian society in paying attention to the possible threats and to ensure our democratic developments. And I am sure that it is the most important guarantee that Ukraine will develop in the right direction. But now, let's win this war. Please do everything to ensure necessary international support and support of societies of our partners to Ukraine. There was a question, what could we do better?
Yeah.
I would say that speed and sustainability of supply of all necessary weapons and military equipment are crucial to defend our country, our lives, to restore our territorial integrity and move on the post-war development. You remember that since the beginning of full-scale invasion, there were a lot of discussion to give to which kind of weapons is possible to give to Ukraine. At the end of the day, we receive it. But if it would be faster, it would be less costly in terms of human lives, which we are paying for get to the victory. Please support us in promoting and implementing peaceful formula proposed by President Zelensky. Please be confident in our victory. Yes, I cannot but agree that now it is important to speak not about narratives that Ukraine shouldn't lose, but about being confident in that Ukraine must win. Help us to win and to make Russia accountable for its crimes of aggression and genocide. If we don't do it, this crime will be repeated sooner or later. We count very much on your further support and we are sure in our common victory. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all of you for supporting Ukraine, and I hope that our common victory will be sooner because of our dedication. Thank you very much.
Lyubov, thank you so much. You can see why you are a woman of history and substance. You have done much locally, and for that we are grateful, but pay homage to the fact that you've been strong, resilient, and spoken out and spoken with confidence about the need to do things differently and better. So thank you for joining us, very much so. And we hope that people, the world community, continue to listen, because the dilemma, I can imagine if you're sitting within Ukraine, I don't think any of us will know what it is to be under attack, to feel insecure every day, and to not know whether our children are safe, our partners are safe, or our parents are safe, and whether they will survive the day. None of us can actually imagine what it's like to be where you are. But I think against that, world organizations, those who are in international agreements, are constantly worried about, can I actually go that further distance without triggering a global war? And this is the issue for many people, are thinking that actually, if I do this, it's going to be interpreted as that. The thing is, it's a game of chess, and fact is, Putin knows what he's doing. And I think at some point there needs to be a kind of come to the stage where you have to realize that innocent lives, whilst we might consider them to be a necessary cost, but at what cost are we not prepared to take a very different approach, a speedier, more effective response to the situation we find ourselves in? As I said, that's one of our clarion calls, is not to normalize it. The only way we can do that is to act with speed. And as I said, more generously. Thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to say, again, colleagues, I urge you to react, comment, share your thoughts. It could be anything in relation to what you've just heard. Whilst you're thinking, I'm going to move on to our next contributor. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, what we have in this panel is the various facets of building a better, good, just, fair society and a good democracy. So when we're thinking about that, there's an essential institution that's been given birth to in the last part of the century, which is about ombudsmen. And it goes back many years, actually decades, and actually in history, but it's not called an ombudsman. But the reality is we have an institution in many parts of the world which guarantees a certain check and a balance against power in ways of dealing with unfair treatment, issues of justice, and making sure people have the right for recourse when they feel they've been treated wrongly. So I'm really pleased to have Roman with us. Roman, thank you for joining us. You are the Ombudsman for Ukraine, and very, very pleased to have you with us. Tell me, we know it's important to have the institution that you represent. Can you share with us, in the same way that other contributors have, is where do you think you are right now in the fight against corruption, and what we need to keep our eye on, almost like with a steely gaze, to make sure we don't fall back, or Ukraine doesn't fall back? Because we saw, even recently, and many people would have been irked by this, that all the aid, there were a couple of politicians that were pocketing the money and actually perhaps could have undermined the global effort. And we don't, we have to appreciate the fact that politicians, it's really important they act with integrity and authenticity. You are one of those in the, I suppose, in the wider infrastructure of creating a good society and good governance. Tell us, where do we find ourselves in the fight against corruption? What do we need to keep our mind on and our eyesight on in terms of the fight against corruption? Roman, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. First, two little clarifications. I'm the ombudsman for the business side of things in Ukraine. There is another ombudsman who deals with the human rights concerns that, for example, are very much in the world of Oleksandra Matviichuk. But business is also a part of civil society. And indeed, at the outset of this phase of the invasion, what is, of course, overall a 9-year war, but the latest intense phase, Ukrainian business kind of put many of its assets on the table. Companies paid taxes in advance. Companies voluntarily bought all sorts of things for territorial defense and for the army. companies released their staff voluntarily or dealt with staff being mobilized. So making a big contribution in what could and should have been a step change in the relationship between Ukrainian business and the Ukrainian state. Historically, in the years since independence, they've kind of stared warily at each other, and business hoped not to be bothered by the state, but did not have great expectations of it. Right now, of course, Ukrainian business, like everybody else in Ukraine, is desperate for the state to physically protect it against people who want to blow up their physical plant or enslave their workers. So there is a common cause. What we'll need in the post-war period is a common understanding of the rules of the road and the rule of law and of business ethics. And this is where it's important that the state not miss opportunities of a reboot to a more collaborative relationship, as opposed to this kind of wary or avoidance relationship of the past. There is, again, literally a rights aspect to our work. In our casework, we often refer back to the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights in terms of both due process and the right to property and restitution. There is an important element, I think, again, going forward, now that Ukraine is an EU candidate, of the various European rules formulated in the acquis that Ukraine will need to demonstrably implement. But as we know from the experience of previous states entering, countries are often on their best behavior during the accession period. Once they're in, they sort of kick back, relax, and say, let the good Orban times roll, shall we say, as in the case of Hungary. And discovering then that without internal constraints, there isn't all that much that fellow members of the EU can do about someone who is chosen to look at various European rules as voluntary guidelines and not, directives for action. Oleksandra Matviichuk mentioned that freedom is a #1 value for Ukrainians. Indeed, it is. We see that especially in segments of the economy. I mean, we have literally seen much of the old economy physically destroyed. In other words, the large industrial plants that were the power base of the old-time oligarchs, many of them have literally been blown up. Azovstal is of course, the most famous example. The industry that has stood the test of war and is now the second biggest exporter and the greatest value-adding exporter in Ukraine is the IT sector.
Yeah.
This is a sector that has been characterized in Ukraine, as it is all over the world, by a sort of certain freedom-loving nature. It needs to be allowed to continue to develop and to help turn Ukraine into a country that is attractive to its own citizens. That sounds kind of contradictory,
I know.
Or weird, but in a situation where you have had mass displacement within the country and out of the country, Ukraine doesn't only need to do the traditional task that most governments do of let's attract foreign investment, which may be very important. It needs to attract back 4 million of its own people. And for that, Ukraine post-war needs to not only be tolerable, it needs to be an actual magnet. And quite likely, the demographic challenge of return, and just by definition, not every single person will return. I mean, we're probably looking at a loss of at least 20% of those who left and for various reasons won't come back.
Yeah.
Is that Ukraine will need to become attractive to people from other countries and other cultural spheres. And again, that's a difficult change, and we've seen it in other countries that were traditionally net exporters of people don't have the institutions and also don't have the societal mindset for welcoming and integrating people from other countries who will be necessary for the process of reconstruction. So Ukraine will, which has become a very solidified entity during the war, will also need to become more diverse to prosper and thrive in a post-war environment. So that is certainly an area where you can then draw on the experience of other countries within the EU and also internationally. But it's one that will be essential as well to success. So you need to be attractive to your own citizens, but also to those of other countries. And so that is maybe a final thought, that it's important also that the fight against corruption not turn into score settling or a situation where veterans coming back from war and naturally have a burning desire for justice and fairness, where things turn into vigilantism, for example. So you need justice, but not vengeance in settlements that will happen in the post-war period, both in terms of the business community and in terms, of course, of justice overall. And that's pretty much where I wrap it up.
Roman, thank you. Roman, thank you very much. That's really helpful and thoughtful again. That whole issue, and my apologies, I referenced you wrongly, but of course you're the business ombudsman, representative of the council. That there's, all the points you make are absolutely the right ones, and I think the challenge is how do you meet those? Because in the sense you've had this kind of exodus, if you like, of both people and private sector. I suppose my question to you in follow-up is very briefly, what sense do you get of a business community internationally and in Europe getting ready to reinvest? Is there, are there any markers you can point to that would suggest that's happening? And secondly, you make the point really well about the fact that Ukraine has to become a magnet and attractive back, not only for its own citizens and nationals, but also the wider community. And often when you're traveling in that area, where you're also traveling in the east of Europe, but also in parts of Europe now, when after the corruption scandal in the European Parliament, there's a view that we'll lose the faith of citizens who think actually they're all the same, they're all at it, and actually we can't trust any of them. And that cynicism can be bred very quickly. What's your view in terms of the kind of how we might really ensure, or rather put some form of shock absorbers in the system that can enable the fact that we need to make sure we get the anti-corruption agenda right? So first on the private sector and on the anti-corruption agenda, very briefly.
Okay. On the private sector, I think about 2-3 weeks ago, there was an event called Rebuild Ukraine in Warsaw, and it was literally a kind of trade show for companies interested in rebuilding Ukraine. Hundreds of companies showing up. You can imagine that post-war Ukraine will be Europe's and possibly the world's biggest single building site. And even in very basic things, if you are in the business of manufacturing windows and doors, a country where thousands and millions of them have been blown out is going to look very attractive to you. This will be, both with Ukrainian investment and also massive international investment, an economic engine for the whole region. The question is, how will the returns from that be divided? And will people feel that that is being done fairly, that opportunities are created as well for small business, medium business, ordinary people, as well as Wall Street investment funds? So that's one thing. The second thing is anti-corruption. I am myself more of a fan of prevention rather than sort of spectacular punitive actions. Simplifying rules, digitizing, and Ukraine has gone a lot. It's one of Europe's leaders in digitizing a whole range of government procedures, which means that there is now no friction points where person-to-person engagement is required to get a whole range of documents, and that's a good thing. I think further progress needs to be made on that. Also, simplification of procedures, and I've been talking to some of the people who are preparing the Ukraine's reconstruction agenda.
Yeah.
They are looking at incorporating anti-corruption organizations and activists and databases right into their plans. So you've got to build it in from day one.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very helpful. And again, as I said at the start, an essential building block of a good democracy, and one that actually, a good democracy also relies on the consent of its population, its public. So therefore, I speak a sense of trust and hope and faith in the fact that institutions will work in an impartial manner are going to be essential. We have a good question on, there are a couple of questions actually. We have Jakub. Jakub, you're thinking that this debate is rather Eurocentric. So I want to bring you in a moment and to share your thoughts on how can we change that, if you have that feeling. But we also have someone from DG NEAR, Matteo. Matteo, thank you for your question to David. So in essence, if I can bring you on screen, if you could comment. But Matteo, what you're saying really is that does the end of the conflict, or the type of the end of conflict, i.e. whether it ends up being frozen or negotiated, etc., affect the post-war narrative? Do you want to add anything more to that before I bring in David? So where are you?
No, I think it's that's the essence of the question. Thank you.
Okay, good. David, over to you.
All right. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And yes, I think it does matter how the war ends. And we can go from sort of best to worst. The war ends, the war is best for supporting liberal democracy and generating a liberal supporting narrative if the war concludes quickly and decisively, meaning that there is sufficient Western aid so that Ukraine can prevail on the battlefield. And it's clear that Ukraine, has won, because that creates the space for this idea that there's been this, sort of at least shared effort in bringing about Ukraine's freedom. Sort of the middling one is that if we get stuck in a frozen conflict, because the longer that conflict goes on, the more it creates the space for a narrative to emerge, where the West just really doesn't care, that this is not really about Ukraine's freedom. It's just about, imposing costs on Russia because of some, greater conflict, and therefore the West is just fine with the idea that Ukrainians are suffering and continue to suffer, because that's not really what's driving them. What's really driving them is a broader conflict with Russia. And so a frozen conflict doesn't really help. But by far the worst, I think, is a negotiated end to the settlement, where that negotiation is seen as coming from either pressure by Ukraine's partners to say, look, let's settle this war now, in a way that says, look, this is not Ukraine's choice.
What a pity.
Side. And so we have historical, sort of analogies, which is, sort of after the end of World War I, you had, the whole idea of the stab in the back in Germany, which destabilized Weimar politics and helped, fuel the rise of Nazism in Germany. And so a negotiated settlement is very dangerous, where it is being seen as being, sort of motivated by what.
Yeah, we keep on you keep on cutting out, I'm afraid.
Because of,
I know. The internet is such an unreliable lover, It's such a shame, such a shame. And you're coming out with...
I'm sorry about that.
You cannot come up with a gel, absolute, a pearl of wisdom, and there, boom, the internet cuts you off. I'm sure it's a bot from somewhere. Not at all, no, I'm sure it's not. But, perhaps you can post some of your comments on the chat so Matteo can get a sense of that. I want to also bring in Amelia. Amelia, are you from the EAS? Are you still there? Have you disappeared? I know you don't have a video on, but are you may be kind of, now that I've tagged you, you might be disappearing out of sight. I was just thinking that as you are there from the External Action Service, it would be great to get your perspective, but clearly not there. Paul, our dear senior fellow from Friends of Europe, you've posted a question. Paul, I would rather you just ask that question, because I'm not sure I can clearly read what you've put on the chat. So very briefly, so Paul Taylor, producer of our security studies for Friends of Europe, also a well-kent journalist for Politico and Reuters previously. There, I've done the intro for you, Paul. Go straight to the question. And good to have you on the panel.
My apologies, I wasn't in right at the start of this because I'm on grandparent duties today, but so apologies if this has already been addressed. My one sentence question is, what collective rights, if any, do the speakers envisage for Russian speakers in the liberated areas or the to be liberated areas of Ukraine after the war? Thank you.
Very interesting, thoughtful question again. Who would like to have a go at that? I was going to say, yes, I was going to say, Nia, but I was going to ask you to come in. So please do. Yes.
Thank you very much for this question. I would say that in Ukraine we have rights for indigenous people, which are enshrined in the law, which I mentioned, which was adopted in Ukraine, and rights of national minorities are envisaged in law on national minority, which was adopted recently. We have no collective rights in Ukraine. According to our constitution, to national minority, we have individual rights which are protected. So we plan to proceed according with our legislation and according with our constitution.
So in short, what are you saying therefore, madam?
In short, there are no collective but individual rights of national minorities.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Anyone else want to go at that question? Please, our next speaker. Thank you, Edward, for joining us. Actually, why don't I move to you in any case? I want you to spend the last section of this debate around the issue of rights, fairness, justice, and how do we make sure we maintain that essential plank foundation of a good, healthy, functioning democracy, which is about equalities, tackling inequalities, but making sure people can walk with pride and a sense of fairness in the streets and have a sense of relationship to their wider society. Edward, over to you.
Yeah, first, actually, I would love to address the question about Russian speakers.
Please do.
Ukraine has one state language, which is Ukrainian, which is kind of logic. And the thing is that the war, which we're in now, is anti-colonial war. And Ukraine was a colony of Russia for centuries in different forms, including in USSR, as many other countries were colonies of the main country in USSR, which is Russia. And Russia tried to destroy Ukrainian nation kind of through the whole existence of Russia. So the thing why we have a lot of Russian speakers in Ukraine, because of the colonization, because of the forced tries to destroy Ukrainian language for centuries and through the whole 20th century as well. The war which is happening now is the next try of Russia to destroy Ukraine, to destroy Ukrainians and destroy Ukrainian language. That's why we have to work on promoting Ukrainian language in Ukraine. And that's why, as it has been said already, people who speak other languages definitely have the whole right to speak their languages in Ukraine, but the state language is Ukrainian. And businesses, state organizations, and so on have to go with that. So I'm sorry that I'm being emotional, but it's very important for Ukraine. That's what I wanted to say.
No, you should, absolutely. Don't apologize. This is, we're in a context of a war. And, those of us who are not where you are cannot feel the pain and the daily existence and lives of what's happening in everyday life on the streets across Ukraine. We are watching stuff happen. So, please do not apologize. I will come back to Paul because I'm trying to understand what's motivated his question, because some might say this is kind of a divergence and a digression from what the real issues are. But we'll come back to you, Paul. That's a challenge to you directly. But I want to bring Lyubov again back because your hand is up.
Yes, I think that it's very right that you understand our emotional reaction to this issue. You know that when I started to speak, I said that since 2014, Russia tried to speak about the Ukrainian nationalism. And in reality, every attempt of Ukraine to ensure that representative of national minorities speak Ukrainian state language were presented like attempt to deprive them from their national identity. I cannot more than agree that it is war against colonialism, and in reality, there is Ukrainian language which need to be guaranteed and defended in Ukraine, what is a strange situation, but it is a result of this colonial policy of Russia. And I think that it is very important also to understand it in the whole context of war. And I think that the fact that this issue is still raised, which kind of rights should receive Russian language in Ukraine, shows that Russia is quite successful in their propaganda during the very long period of time, saying that the reason of war, reason of aggression is some kind of lack of rights for Russian language. And it's very important also to look to example of our Baltic states, which are still being in European Union, has to solve the problem which was resulted from being part of this Soviet Union of our colonial past in framework of this union, so-called union, where Ukrainians and other nations were deprived from everything. And I also would like to remind to the previous, one of the previous attempt of Russian genocide towards Ukrainian people, Holodomor. In this period of time, when millions of Ukrainians were deprived from their lives, a lot of Russians were moved to those regions of Ukraine where we, in last period of time, have a lot of Russian-speaking people. So it was artificial Russification of Ukraine, and now we have to fix this problem, not to prolong this problem for future. And yes, it is very emotional.
Of course. Lyubov, also, I remember, you know, those of us who were kind of obviously captured by what was happening, watching every day as the, you know, days and weeks unfolded into something that has become now a year-long invasion. But I remember in the early days, the story was about women who had to leave, and we've seen the largest exodus of women in any war situation coming into Europe. Literally millions of them across various borders. But I remember watching a particular caption that was caught by a really thoughtful journalist, where a group of women of different ages were in tears, thinking and saying, why are you actually doing this? They're referring to Russian soldiers, saying that you have been our brothers, you have been our family in the past, we speak the same language, but why are you doing this? And there's something about the emotion of that, about how this war has torn into a narrative of very local people that has been artificially created, if you like, as we have seen in many, many times in our history. And so it's, you know, you make the point extremely well that we need to make sure that we understand the emotional setting and context and the impact this is having on local communities and national communities. So thank you very much for coming back. Paul, very briefly, because I want to spend the rest of the time talking about that issue of equalities and rights, because it's key, as I said, to good nation building. Paul, back to you, very briefly.
Yeah, I knew when I asked the question that I would be touching a raw nerve.
Indeed.
And the soft option was not to ask it, but I think we do need to ask it. We don't have a one-size-fits-all policy on this in Europe, whether you talk about the European Union or the area covered by the Council of Europe. We do, on the other hand, have some institutions which are there to give us guidance, and one of those institutions is the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe. And I would hope that a future post-war Ukrainian government would seek advice from the Venice Commission on these minority language issues and implement that advice. The one thing I would say is, you know, we have a very vast range in the EU, for example, between Catalonia, which, where a region speaks its own national language, other areas where people speak Hungarian in Romania, Slovakia, and so on, and have language education and so on, and others. And of course, many of those could be described and are described by participants as being the result of different forms of colonialism over the centuries. So that's all I wanted to tease out those issues, because I suspect that if indeed this war does end, as we all hope, with a Ukrainian victory, that those issues will not go away and that they'll need to be addressed. That's all I want. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. Lyubov, I'm going to bring you in very briefly because I really want to go back to Edward for this section, last section on...
I just would like to answer these two issues. With regard to Venice Commission is already looking into this law on national minorities, and I would like also to mention that Venice Commission recommendation on the law on education were implemented by Ukraine. And other thing, I think that it is not very good example when we speak about Catalonia or such cases, because there is no difference in Ukraine on regional basis based on history. And there is directly mention of Holodomor was done now, because it was artificial exchange of Ukrainian population after killing them. What Russia is trying to make again now, to commit genocide, to kill Ukrainians. You see what happens now on temporarily occupied territories. They try to bring their Russians, but doesn't mean that these regions become because of these Russian-speaking regions.
Indeed.
And there is a difference that is very important to understand, that there is no historical, no geographical reasons for having Russian-speaking population, but only reasons of colonial policy and genocide. That is why we don't say that and it's very important again, and I agree that it is needed to be mentioned. We don't plan to prohibit to people to speak Russian language or any other language which is their native language. But we plan to create condition when everybody in Ukraine, all citizens are equal, and it means that they speak properly state language, which should be respected and should have this right and as a state language. And I think that if you look to any European Union country, the rights of state language more or less equal. And I agree with you that European Union does not have unique policy. It's not a policy of European Union which in sphere of national minority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Again, very thoughtful, direct, but absolutely a contribution that sets the balances out this equation of language issues. Thank you very much for that. Edward, I want to come back to you because I really want us to focus on what we do, especially because we keep on having this reference to the ghosts of the past, learning from the past. We saw what happened in just under 100 years ago, where you had the Jewish tag, then you had women, children, and then you had lesbians and gays. And you saw how the gay community, lesbian gay community were treated, even in that stratification at the end of, or at the time of the Second World War. We need to learn lessons from that. Tell us, share with us your thoughts, that how do you continue to raise the flag or the emotional importance, but also the political sociological importance of equalities, especially for LGBTQI communities who will be at the sharp edge of this war in many, many ways. Over to you, Edward. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. The first thing that I wanted to address is the one that you mentioned at the start about the so-called masculine narrative of the war, soldier, the man, and so on. It is totally not a thing for Ukraine, because as it was mentioned several times today by other speakers, thanks a lot for that, Ukrainian war with Russia is not it's kind of very special war. It's the war for our existence as a nation. It's a war for our freedom. It's a war for our values. And there is no Ukrainian who is kind of lower in the system, because we are all Ukrainians and we are all fighting to remain Ukrainians, and we are all fighting to survive. So it doesn't mean if we are female, if we are queer, if we are, I don't know, people of color who are Ukrainians. We all fight for our existence, and we all fight to get rid of Russia at last, because we are very tired of Russia. So if we are talking about the representation of LGBTQ people now in Ukraine, we have a lot of openly queer LGBTQ plus people who are fighting on the front line. We have a lot of people who volunteer, who help the army. We have a lot of activists who stayed in Ukraine and who are working for Ukraine, as myself, for example. We have a lot of people who support LGBTQ plus rights. And we have several different surveys and reports made starting from last year to this year, which show that support of LGBTQ rights in Ukraine grow very fast. We had one report which started in 2022, and it was finished in February 2022, before the big invasion, and it showed that in comparison to 2016, support of gay marriage, LGBTQ rights in general, has grown in several dozens of percent. I don't know how to say it correctly, but now 60+% people in Ukraine are totally supportive or neutral to LGBTQ rights. And those who are not, they are mostly less educated, because they just don't know a lot about what queer people are. And KyivPride, my organization, and others are working on that to change the situation. And also, many people, unfortunately, are still, I would say, affected by Russian propaganda. Mm-hmm. And we all know that Russian state policy is homophobia, transphobia, sexism, and racism. But at the same time, many people who were homophobic or transphobic before the big invasion, they change their mind, because they understand that all this xenophobia is Russian state policy, and they don't want to have anything in common with Russia. So they start to think about their values and change their values to more, as we call it, European values. Mm-hmm. So I would say that Ukraine is definitely fighting for its existence and so on, but it's also fighting for equality in the Ukrainian nation, inside the Ukrainian nation. And visibility of LGBTQ people in this invasion year have grown a lot. First, because of the LGBTQ soldiers who are visible. We had many visible queer soldiers before the invasion, like starting from 2014. But now there is more, because we have many people who were visibly queer and open before the invasion, and they were not soldiers, but now they became soldiers. And these are women, lesbians and bisexual women. These are non-binary people. These are trans people. These are gay men. And we have an organization of LGBTQ soldiers and veterans, which is very popular and vocal and visible, and I think that you have heard of them. So as for corruption and laws, we're definitely working on that. And I think that you also heard that Ukrainian citizens created the petition to president to make gay marriage possible in Ukraine. And now legislators and activists and lawyers are already working on this law. Actually, they have been working on that before the big invasion, but this petition kind of pushed this process also. And also we had an anti-hate crime law, which is still a bill. It was introduced in 2020, and it had to be voted in 2022, but it didn't happen because of the invasion. So we really hope that anti-hate crime bill will become a law maybe sometime soon. And as already was mentioned, President signed Istanbul Convention.
Yes.
So I would say that the movement to equality, to freedom for everyone in the country was also kind of fastened by this war. And it's very sad to say, but it happened because of the war.
Sure.
I don't know how it would be if we didn't have this full-scale invasion of Russia. But I understand that in many things, even now, even we still don't have gay marriage, for example, we still don't have a full-scale anti-hate crime law. I see that even now, Ukraine is better than some European countries.
Indeed.
In some things, according to the human rights, for example, like transition process for trans people in Ukraine is much faster and much easier than, for example, in Denmark or Sweden. I experienced on myself because I had to move for some time to Denmark and tried to do something there, but it's totally impossible, even if you are Danish and trans. So Ukraine is much better in many things even now. And I really hope that the support that we have now in rebuilding the country, in weapons, I'm extremely thankful for all of that, to all of our partners. And I hope that we also will have this kind of support in the ideas of human rights. Thank you.
Edward, it's been I'm so glad we had you on, and thank you, all of you, because I'm running into the last 10 minutes. But you know what's so heartening and reassuring about what you're saying is that at a time of conflict, the issue for rights for those who don't actually usually enjoy them, as one would in more wider societies, have actually been further consolidated and improved. And so it's heartening to know that even at a time of war, the issues for equalities, the Istanbul Convention, but also for LGBTQI issues are being warmly supported. And if I can sum up, what's heartening to hear is you're saying that, on the equalities front, we're doing well, we're okay. We have visibility both at the front line and through the supply chain of the war effort. And actually we're seeing changes in people's hearts and minds, the survey that you represent. So really it's not about trying to be able to create improved equality, but it's really the war effort. The focus is very much about free Ukraine from the Russians and enable it to be a strong, powerful democratic nation. I think your point is also right that when we think about just look across into mainland Europe, Poland, Hungary. I mean, who'd have thought that in the EU there'll be a conversation about gay-free zones? And the fact that these are people receiving European people's tax-paying money, that you have leaders that would actually think of creating such things as a part of the European Union. So your points are extremely well made. Thank you very much for that. I want to bring in a couple of people just in the last few minutes that I have. Seraphim, you're from the Gay Forum of Ukraine. Are you still there? Excellent. Would you put yourself off mute and so I can hear you? We can all hear you. I want you to. Hi, Seraphim. Thank you for joining us. Would you just reflect on what you've heard from Edward also, in that sense of, do you share that analysis? And anything addition you'd like to say about what we do in relation to potentially a post-war Ukraine?
I support the point of view of Edward, Reese, but I'm not so optimistic about LGBT rights in Ukraine because of war we have big polarization of opinions, and we have two trends. Like one trend more compassion. People are more compassionate towards each other, but at the same time, a lot of people became more cruel, more radical. And it caused traumatizing PTSD disorders, and a lot of different trauma situations.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like two controversial trends. So I'm afraid that if we are not put efforts about maintaining psychological health in Ukraine, like raising these questions like depression, PTSD, trauma response, we can achieve in future a lot of violence in a peaceful time.
Thank you very much.
Especially about marginalized groups.
Absolutely.
Like LGBT or like minorities, national minorities, or
absolutely
vulnerable groups.
Thank you very much for responding. I know that you weren't prepared for me to pull you in, but you know, that's a part of this. This is what we are about at Friends of Europe, where it's not about a panel, it's about all of you being the brain in the room. In my last few minutes that I have, can I just reflect with you on what this means more broadly about the Balkans? Just for a moment, we see what's happened in Ukraine. We see that a lot of the Balkan countries, Western Balkans, have been kept almost on the longest date you could imagine. They've been a promise, there's been a bit of a dating, but it's taken sometimes 15 years, 10 years, 7 years to actually join the relationship of the EU. I just want to ask anybody who's got a view on what are the broader lessons here about what the EU does to create more Europe around it, so that you're able to create a shield around Europe against illiberal democracies. And so, you know, any thoughts on that would be really warmly welcome. David, can I come to you first? And then Oleksandra, I want to ask you as well, just some final views on that, and then other contributors. So David, very briefly, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very clear that we need to, you know, first and foremost think about how it is that we enshrine the liberal values into domestic law, and to make it in a way that is sustainable, and that is very hard in a post-conflict situation. And I think also that you know, we need to think about ways of accelerating the EU accession process, because, you know, the longer the countries lag on the, you know, on the periphery, you know, the more frustrations grow, and the more that they begin to look for other models. And so those are, you know, sort of two of the things that I would immediately think about here.
Thank you very much. Oleksandra, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that current situation and our past is a bright illustration that human rights and peace has inextricably linked. And all the situation become possible because for decades, the so-called well-developed democracies closed their eyes for the human rights violation which Russia committed against their own citizens. Russia imposed homophobic laws, Russia persecutes civil society, killed journalists, jailed human rights defenders, but well-developed democracies continue to do business as usual, shake Putin's hand, build gas pipelines, etc., etc. So I must emphasize that the political decision has to be based not just on economical benefits or security issue, but as human rights values as well. And not only in internal policy, but in external policy also. And this can help to prevent the wars in future.
Well, Oleksandra, thank you very much. Roman.
Yeah, in a previous life, I was Canadian ambassador to Serbia.
Indeed.
And was just there last weekend. One thing to bear in mind is that with Ukraine now becoming a candidate, it is the biggest country. It's the late breaking, but it's also the biggest country in the peloton. That means it needs to do a lot of learning from the Western Balkans countries, from their past decade and a half of candidacy. But also for those countries, Ukraine has the active civil society, it has the intellectual capacity, et cetera, to also help them all progress faster if they get their act together. So I think there's a need, and maybe organizations like yours could do this, to build on the Ukraine-Western Balkans relationship.
Absolutely. And, you know, as Paul has his hand up, we recently launched our study on the Western Balkans just last December at our Balkan Summit, which was trying to explain or think through the implications of what is happening in the Balkans, mostly for, you know, peace, security, defense matters, but also paid homage to the Ukraine war. Paul, can I very briefly bring you in? Then I'm going to go to Edward, I'm going to come to you, and then I want to give you, Lyubov, the last word on the debate. So firstly, Paul.
Yeah, so very briefly, I agree with everything that both David and Roman said. I think the other thing is that I sense that some of the countries in the Western Balkans, particularly Serbia, is getting a bit spooked about how it might be leapfrogged by Ukraine in the race to Europe, and that might have a very salutary stimulative effect in Serbia. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was one of the reasons why Serbia took a step forward this week in at least appearing to agree to a normalization route with Kosovo. So if that's the case, then, you know, Ukraine might win battles on more than one front.
Paul, thank you. For those of you, I don't know if any of you have been to Niš in Serbia. I was there less than 6 months ago, and it was quite unsettling that actually in this small town in Niš, you had a major 1,000-meter square facility that had been recently built that was called, you know, humanitarian aid, funded by Russians, and you had Russian helicopters monitoring the city every day. So let's be mindful of what's going on in terms of looking at thinking granularly, in a granular manner about why some of the issues that stem into Serbia are also about how illiberal democracies, I suppose, flirt and engage with those who are on the tipping edge of illiberalism. Edward, I want to come to you on the issue of equalities. Equalities is borderless, I'm sure you'll agree. And actually, the more of a coalition you have across the Balkans and elsewhere, the better it is for societies across the piece. Your comment on the Western Balkans?
I don't think that I'm kind of capable to comment on the Western Balkans, but what I would love to say at the point that we all have to take Russia seriously. And as mentioned already, they have their influence on Serbia, they have their influence on other countries, and we have to understand that evil exists. And by this moment, the evil is Russia. And we don't have to compare Russia to some other evil in the past. They are evil right now, and they are sometimes even more evil than some evil people in the past. So I think that we have to look through very thoroughly to what Russia does in other countries, to their propaganda in other countries, because sometimes their propaganda is hiding very well, as we can see, for example, in Serbia, in Italy, in the United States, in many other countries. So that's just my last point, that please take Russia seriously and fight it on all the front lines that is possible.
Well said, Edward. Thank you very much. Lyubov, I wish to give you the floor for the last comment on this debate.
Thank you very much. You know, I would like to say that this year, in terms of changes in our mentality, in our attitude, in our life, can be compared to what a lot of nations go through, not even decades, but hundreds of years. And why do I say it? I would like to say that in my personal perception, like Ukraine is a miracle. And also our unity across together with Ukraine is also one miracle, which we have to preserve. And we have to have more trust in our ability to change. I think that if you look to numbers of support of Ukraine for EU membership, 87%, for NATO membership, 86%. And for this number of Ukrainians who are confident in our victory, 95%. We should be sure that this kind of unity and dedication means that Ukrainian society is also ready for really very serious changes. We're paying very, very big price. We are not paying it for having one country which is not democratic, which is not united, and which is not developed. So I think that Ukrainians already has shown that they are able to reach the goal when they are really dedicated. And we are really dedicated to win this war, and we are really dedicated to make democratic, prosperous Ukraine member of European Union and NATO. But, you know, when I spoke at the beginning, I said that everything is, what we are speaking now is very important, but the most important now still to concentrate on winning this war. Speed and sustainability of supply of weapons in one of the crucial things. We are ready to fight, but we need those things, those weapons with which we will be able to win. So once more, thank you very much for this conversation, for support of all your countries, and please let's remain united and to bring closer our joint victory. Thank you.
Lyubov, I'm so glad that I gave you the floor to conclude this powerful, thoughtful, arresting, stimulating conversation and discussion, but also the high emotion in it, in that actually we cannot afford, and whilst I agree with you, Edouard, that we shouldn't be looking to the past, but the past is important as long as you learn from it and you realize the mistakes you've made, and therefore you don't enter the definition of insanity, which is endlessly repeating the same process, hoping for a different outcome. And that's why I invoke the past, is that actually if human progress means anything, we need to learn from the past in a meaningful way. What this war has demonstrated is that not only are people suffering again on Europe's soil, but actually some of the systems, infrastructure that we've put into place post-war are simply not fit for purpose, perhaps, and need a rethink. And so our plea, I think, is we really need to stop acting with the norm of the past, that actually the situations and solutions that we've created post-war are going to put us in good stead for the future. They are simply not. And I hope that you will work with us in hoping to present those questions, dilemmas, and scrutinize the future, because Ukraine is one fundamental aspect of that, but there are going to be multiple sequential as well as parallel conflicts in our world with the onset of digitalization and climate change. So, colleagues, this is a wake-up call for a different kind of normality that we need to think about, which is to deal with uncertainty and unpredictability for all of us. So thank you all very much, and as this debate concludes, let's not normalize this war. Thank you all very much for your time and your energy and commitment, and take care and be safe and mind your distance. Take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Am I off?